The throne room of Veridian Palace had been full since dawn, and the throne at its head was not empty. A woman stood beside it, and the crown of the old kingdom sat upon her dark hair, and the gold of it had been hers for the better part of an hour, while every great house of the realm watched and said nothing aloud. She did not sit. She had refused the seat. She stood with one gloved hand resting on the carved arm of the throne, as though she were minding it for someone, and the diamonds along the cornice threw cold light down across a gown of plain gray silk that no one in that room would have chosen for a coronation. The peers, in their robes of crimson and ermine, had arranged themselves in tiers along the marble, and they had come to crown a man, and the man was not there. The doors at the far end stayed shut. The orchestra had played the processional twice, and then stopped. And in the silence that followed, the realm's most senior bishop had turned to the only person of royal blood standing within reach, and he had set the crown where the law permitted him to set it, because the law did not permit an empty right, and the hour had passed, and someone had to be sovereign before noon. To the assembled court, she was an embarrassment, dressed as a solution. She was Lady Margaret Ashworth, the late King's ward, a girl taken into the household at 7 and kept there, out of a charity that everyone agreed had gone on too long. She had no fortune anyone could name. She had no faction. She had a gray gown and a steady mouth, and a way of standing very still while the great houses decided things about her, and the room had long ago filed her under a single word and forgotten her beneath it. Stay a moment longer than the court did, and watch what they would not. There is more here than a late man and a borrowed crown. She had not asked for the gold on her head. She had argued against it in a low voice that the bishop had overruled, and now it sat there heavier than she had imagined a thing of metal could be, pressing a truth into her skull that she could not yet read. What the court did not know, what she herself did not yet fully know, was that the man who had failed to arrive had not overslept and had not fled. Somewhere beyond the shut doors, a carriage had been stopped on a flooded road 3 hours from the capital, and the man inside it had been doing arithmetic with his life, and the answer he kept reaching frightened him more than any road ever had. His name was Julian, Duke of Caromere, and he was to have been king by his cousin's will and the realm's consent, and he was late because a bridge had gone out beneath a spring flood near the village of Wren's Hollow, and because he had stopped to pull a drowning carter's boy from the current with his coronation coat still on, and because afterward, soaked and shaking on the bank, he had looked at the ruined road ahead and understood that he would not reach the palace by noon, and had felt beneath the dread of it something he could not name as anything but relief. He had not wanted the crown. He had wanted it the way a man wants a debt paid, as a thing owed and dreaded. The throne had cost his family everything, once already, and he carried the cost in a place behind his ribs that he never opened, and the prospect of sitting where his uncle had sat had kept him awake for a month. So when the bridge went out, a small and terrible voice in him had whispered that the road had decided for him. He had silenced it. He had commandeered a farmer's horse and ridden through the flood, because a man does not abandon a thing because he fears it, and because somewhere in the capital a frightened girl in a gray gown was about to be made to carry what he could not reach in time to carry himself. He did not know it was her. He only knew the right would not wait, and that the law would put the crown on whatever royal head remained. The doors opened at noon. He came in wet to the knee, his dark hair plastered against his brow, his fine coat ruined, and his boots leaving prints across the marble that footmen would scrub for a week, and the entire court turned as one body, and the orchestra did not dare begin. And Julian Caromere stopped 6 paces inside his own coronation, and saw a woman already wearing his crown. Margaret did not move. She had spent 11 years learning not to move when the room turned toward her, learning that stillness was the only dignity a dependent was permitted, and so she stood with her hand on the throne and met the eyes of the man she had heard described 100 times and never once seen. The court had told her he was cold. The court had told her he was proud, and grief-locked, and impossible. a man who had buried more than most and spoke to almost no one. She had expected to be looked through, the way she was looked through every day. He looked at her instead. It was not a long look, and it was not a soft one. His gray eyes went from the crown to her face and held there, and something moved behind them that she could not name, and that the dowager standing nearest the throne named instantly, and with alarm he should have been furious. A lesser man would have been furious, would have crossed the floor and demanded the gold be taken from this nobody's head, and given to its rightful owner. He did none of that. He stood dripping on the marble, and he studied her as though she were a question he had been asked long ago, and had only now been handed the answer to. And the silence stretched until it became a thing the whole room could feel. It was the Dowager Duchess of Halbrook who broke it. She was the late king's sister, a woman of 70, with a spine like a riding crop and a voice that had ended more matches than the marriage market itself, and she had spent the morning in a fury that had nowhere to go. Now it had somewhere. She turned to the Duke with her fan held high against her collarbone, and she spoke in a tone pitched to carry to the tears. "Your Grace, forgive the spectacle," she said. The bishop panicked. We could hardly leave the rite half finished, and there was no one else of blood within reach. So he made do with the ward, a charity case and a borrowed crown. It will be set right within the hour. The word ward landed in the room the way it always landed, soft and final, a label that explained everything and asked for nothing further. Margaret felt the old heat climb her throat, the particular shame of being summarized in public by someone who had never once asked her a single true question, and she kept her face still and her hands steady on the carved arm of the throne, and she did not look down. Her pulse had gone quick at her wrist beneath the glove, though, and the Duke, who was closer now, saw the glove, and saw the wrist, and saw that the steady mouth was costing her something. "Set right," Julian repeated. His voice was low and level, and it did not rise. "You would take a crown off a woman's head in front of the realm to spare me an hour's inconvenience. To restore the proper order, Your Grace." "The proper order," he said, "kept me on a flooded road while a child drowned. I find I have lost my taste for it." He did not explain the child. He did not explain anything. He walked the last paces to the throne, leaving wet prints. And he stopped before the woman in the gray gown, and he did not reach for the crown, and the dowager's fan came down a half-inch in confusion. Margaret found her voice. "Your Grace, the crown is yours. I told the bishop as much. I will give it back gladly." "I have not asked for it back," Julian said. "If you have ever stood in a room that had decided who you were before you spoke, you know the particular silence that follows when someone refuses to read from the script. Stay with her. The road from here is longer than a single hour, and it does not run where the court expects." He turned to the bishop instead, a soft old man clutching his crosier, as though it might absolve him, and Julian asked one question. "Is the rite valid, as performed?" The bishop looked at the floor, at the dowager, at the tears of watching peers, and then he told the truth, because he was a coward but not a liar. "The anointing was performed under the law, Your Grace. By every form it stands. The lady is crowned." A sound went through the court then, low and many-throated, the sound of 300 people recalculating at once. Julian heard it and did not turn toward it. He kept his eyes on Margaret, and for the length of one breath, the ruined Duke and the accidental sovereign simply looked at each other across a foot of cold air, and what passed between them was not yet anything that could be named, but it was not nothing, and the dowager saw that it was not nothing, and resolved in that moment to make it so. The court did not disperse so much as fracture. The peers withdrew in clusters, and the orchestra was dismissed, and within the hour 100 carriages carried the news outward into the city. The crown had fallen wrong. The Duke had come late. The ward had been made queen by a flustered bishop and an open law, and the Duke, God knew why, had not put it right. By evening the story had a shape, and the shape was unkind to Margaret, because the city had been told for years that she was nobody, and a story that began with nobody and ended with a crown was not a story the city wished to believe in. Good faith. Margaret learned the shape of it the next morning, when she woke in a state apartment she had not chosen, in a bed too large for any one person, with a maid she did not know laying out a gown she had never seen. The gold crown sat on a velvet cushion across the room. She had not slept. She had spent the night sitting by the cold hearth turning a small object over in her hands, and she turned it over again now in the gray light, a worn miniature in a brass case, the painted face of a man with kind, tired eyes, and a high collar gone out of fashion 30 years before. Her father. The only thing of his she owned. He had been a country physician with no fortune and no name worth keeping, and he had died when she was 7. And the late king, who had once been treated by him during a fever on a hunting progress and never forgotten the courtesy, had taken the orphan daughter into the royal household out of a debt of gratitude that the court had been unable to forgive her for. Since that was the wound, though she would not have called it that. She had been a debt. She had been a kindness someone did for a dead man, and everyone in the palace knew it. And so she had grown up understanding that her place in the world was a loan that could be called in at any time, and that the safest way to hold a borrowed life was to take up as little of it as possible. She had made herself small. She had made herself useful and quiet and easy to overlook, and she had been so good at it for so long that the crown on the velvet cushion seemed less like an honor than a violation, a thing that made her visible. And visibility was the one luxury she had taught herself never to want. She dressed in her own gray gown and refused the new one. She put the miniature in her pocket, where it had ridden for 11 years. And she went to find the Duke, because a borrowed thing must always be returned, and because she had decided in the night that she would not let the court make her into a thief. She found him in the library, which surprised her, because the court had told her the Duke did not read so much as brood. And what she saw when she came through the tall doors was a man at a long table with a flooded county's maps spread before him, and 3 exhausted clerks taking dictation, organizing relief for the spring floods that had nearly kept him from the throne. He was directing grain. He was directing it with a precision that suggested he had done such work before, and trusted no one else to do it correctly. And when he looked up and saw her in the doorway in her gray gown with her chin level, he set down his pen. "You did not wear the gown they made you," he said. "It is not mine," Margaret answered. "Neither is the crown. I came to return it, Your Grace, and to tell you that I want no part of what the city is saying. I will sign whatever needs signing. I will stand wherever needs standing. The throne is yours." He regarded her for a long moment. "Sit down," he said. It was not a request, and she heard the coldness in it the way the court had taught her to hear coldness, as dismissal, as a man arranging a problem into a chair so he could deal with it efficiently. She sat. She did not yet hear the other thing inside the order. The thing that would have told her the man simply did not want her standing in a doorway, looking as though she might be sent away at any moment. The clerks gathered their papers and withdrew at a glance from him, and the library emptied, and the rain ran down the tall windows. And Julian Caromere looked at the late king's ward and did something no one had done in 11 years. He asked her a true question. "How old were you?" He said, "When they began to call you the ward." She had not expected it. 7, she said. "And before that you had a name, and a father, and a house. A small one, in the north. My father was a physician." "I know," Julian said. "He set my arm when I was a boy, on a road much like the one that flooded yesterday. I remembered it on the bank." He paused, and the pause was the first crack in the carved stone face the court had warned her of. "I did not know the daughter had come here. I have spent 11 years not coming to court, if I could help it. We have been, it seems, in the same house and never in the same room." Margaret did not know what to do with that, so she said the only honest thing, "The court will not let this stand, Your Grace, whatever you intend. The Dowager will not let it stand." "No," he agreed, "she will not." And then, almost to himself, "Let us see what she does." What the Dowager did was begin a campaign, so quiet and so total, that for the first weeks, Margaret mistook it for indifference. There was no open cruelty. There was only the slow architecture of erasure. Invitations to the new queen's morning audiences were misdelivered. The household accounts were submitted to a regency council the dowager chaired, rather than to the queen herself. A bill was drafted, with grave and reluctant language, proposing that the coronation be reviewed by a committee of peers for irregularity, and the dowager spoke of it everywhere in tones of sorrowful duty, as though it pained her to question a right, as though her only concern were the dignity of the crown that a charity case had stumbled into. And the dismissive label traveled with her, refined now into something that wore the clothes of concern. At a card party in the long gallery, behind a fan she did not trouble to lower, the dowager said to Lady Penhallow, loudly enough for the table to hear, "One does not blame the girl. A ward raised on charity cannot help having the instincts of a charity case. She will give the thing up the moment she is frightened enough. They always do." And the table had laughed, the small laugh of people agreeing with power. And Margaret, who had been crossing the gallery on her way to nowhere in particular, had heard every word, and had kept walking, and had felt the miniature press against her hip like a hand. The Duke was not at the card party, but he heard of it, because the Duke heard of everything. And the next morning a footman delivered to the Queen's apartments a single book, a worn volume of northern country remedies, the kind a physician might have carried in a saddlebag, with no note. Margaret turned it over for a long time. It was not a grand gift. It was not jewels or silks or any of the things a man sends a woman he means to flatter. It was a thing that said, "I have thought about who your father was," and the thinking of it undid her more than any jewel could have, and she put it on the shelf beside her bed and did not thank him for it, because she did not yet have the words for what it was. The weeks that followed taught her the Duke by his commands. He did not court her in any way the court would have recognized. He told her things, in his low-level voice, that were orders on their surface and shelter underneath. "Eat something," he said. When a council session had run long and her face had gone pale. Sit, when she stood too long at audiences out of an old dependent's reflex that she had no right to a chair. Walk with me. On the mornings the rain let up, and she would walk the long gravel terraces beside him, while he talked of grain and drainage and the floods. And she learned that the cold man the court feared was a man who had simply decided, somewhere in his grief, that affection spoken plainly was a thing that could be taken away, fed and seated and walked beside, could not. She began, against every instinct she owned, to look for him in rooms. She began to know where he was, without turning her head. Her body learned the fact of him before her mind would permit the word, and the word, when it came near, frightened her more than the dowager ever had. There was a child in the household, a boy of 6, named Thomas, the son of the Duke's late steward, kept on at Caramere's insistence after the man died in the same fever year that had taken so many. The court found the arrangement eccentric. Margaret found the boy in the gardens one gray afternoon, sitting alone beneath a yew, with a wooden horse missing a leg, crying with the silent efficiency of a child who has learned that loud crying brings no one. She did not know she was observed. She sat down on the wet grass in her gray gown, ruining it, and she did not tell the boy to stop, and she did not promise him the horse could be mended, because she did not know that it could. She told him instead about her own father, who had once mended a bird with a splint made from a hairpin, and how the bird had flown anyway, crooked, and how a crooked thing that flies is better than a whole thing that sits in a drawer. And she took the broken horse in the boy's small cold hand, and they went together to find the carpenter, and the whole way the boy held her hand as though it were the only fixed point in a sliding world. Julian watched the entire thing from the library window above the garden. He had come to the window to think, and had stayed to watch, and what he saw was not a charity case, and not an accident of a flustered bishop. He saw a woman who had been given nothing, learn, somehow, to give. He saw the exact thing he had spent 11 years, believing the throne killed and people, alive in a gray gown on the wet grass, and he stood at the window long after they had gone inside, and the carved stone of his face had cracked all the way through, and he did not try to mend it. That night, he did not sleep either. He sat in the dark of his study with a portrait turned to the wall, the portrait of a young woman with his own gray eyes, and he spoke to it once, very low, a single sentence. No one heard. And then he turned it back to face the room for the first time in 11 years. The wound the court had warned her of had a name, and the name was Eleanor. She had been his sister, younger than him by 4 years, and she had been the one their uncle, the king, had meant to use. Not for a crown. For a marriage, a brutal advantageous match to a foreign prince 3 times her age, arranged to seal a treaty, announced at a Coronation Eve ball when Eleanor was 19. She had begged Julian to stop it. He had been 23, and certain that obedience was a kind of safety, that one did not refuse a king, that the road of duty was the only road that did not flood. He had told her to be reasonable. He had told her in a low, level voice he would hate for the rest of his life, to be reasonable. And she had gone to the match, and within a year she was dead, in a cold country of a fever. No one treated in time, and Julian had understood too late that the proper order he had defended had killed the one person he had been put on the earth to protect. He had left court that month. He had not come back if he could help it. And he had carried, behind his ribs, the certain knowledge that he had once let the proper order take a woman he loved, and that he would rather drown on a flooded road than do it twice. Which was why when the Dowager's Committee finally moved, he was already standing where he meant to stand. The Dowager chose the autumn ball for it, the first great gathering of the season, the same long marble room where the crown had fallen wrong in spring. She chose it deliberately, because the court's memory of that morning was sharpest there, and because a thing undone in the room where it was done has a particular finality. The committee's finding would be read aloud between the dances. The coronation would be declared irregular. A new rite would be scheduled, the Duke crowned alone as he should have been, and the ward returned to the obscurity from which a flood and a coward bishop had briefly raised her. The Dowager had arranged the rival too, with her usual thoroughness. A Lady Cordelia Vane in ice blue silk and the family sapphires, beautiful and bored and entirely suitable, positioned near the Duke all evening as the obvious and proper queen the realm had been denied. Margaret came to the ball in the gray gown. She had been advised against it. She wore it anyway, with the miniature in a small reticule at her wrist, and she stood where a queen was meant to stand, and let the room look at her, and the looking was worse than it had ever been, because the room had been told tonight was the night the loan came due. The Dowager found her near the terrace doors where the spring crowd had first watched the crown fall wrong, and she delivered the label for the third and final time no longer behind a fan, but plainly face to face, in the witness center of the room, because she wanted the court to hear her say it before the committee said it for her. "You have had a pleasant few months, child," she said almost gently. "I will allow that you carried it with more composure than I expected from a charity case, but composure is not blood. The crown was never yours. After tonight, you will go back to being what you have always been, which is nothing the realm need, remember, and I think in your heart, you have always known it." And here is the thing the Dowager had counted on, the thing that had worked in every room she had ever entered. She had counted on the girl to lower her eyes. She had counted on the dependent's reflex, the small voice, the gracious surrender. They always give it up, she had said, when they are frightened enough. Margaret was frightened. Her pulse was loud in her throat and her hands were cold inside her. Gloves and every instinct of 11 years was telling her to make herself small, to give the gold back gladly, to slip out of the lit room and back into the safe dark, where no one summarized you because no one looked. She looked instead at the far side of the room, where the Duke stood beside Lady Cordelia Vane in her ice blue silk, and she understood that the safe dark was a kind of drawer, and that she had been a whole thing sitting in a drawer for 11 years, and that her father had told her once that a crooked thing that flies is better than that. So she did not lower her eyes. "You may be right," she said to the dowager, and her voice did not shake, and that steadiness was its own small flag planted in the marble. "I may be nothing the realm need, remember, but I will not pretend I am frightened in order to make your evening easier. If the committee unmakes me tonight, it will unmake me with my eyes open." It was not a grand speech. It was 11 quiet words past the place where she usually stopped, and the dowager's fan came down, because the script had failed, and the failure of the script was a thing the dowager had not felt in 50 years. The committee's clerk mounted the small dais where the orchestra usually sat, and the room hushed, and the finding began to be read. The grave, reluctant language unspooling, irregularity, the dignity of the crown, the recommendation that the right be set aside. Margaret stood very still and kept her eyes open. As she had promised, Lady Cordelia adjusted the family sapphires. The dowager's chin rose by a degree. And across the long marble room, the Duke of Caromere set down his glass and began to walk. He did not hurry. The court would speak of that for years, how he did not hurry, how he crossed the entire length of the room at the unhurried pace of a man who has already decided and has only to arrive. The clerk's voice faltered as the Duke passed the dais, and did not stop at it. Lady Cordelia turned toward him with the small, confident smile of a woman about to be chosen, and he passed her too, without a glance. And the smile died on her face by degrees. As the distance closed and it became clear he was not walking toward the dais, or the rival, or the dowager, but toward the woman in the gray gown by the terrace doors. The woman the entire room had been assembled to unmake. He stopped before her. The room had stopped breathing. He did not address the committee, and he did not address the dowager, and he did not raise his voice. He looked at Margaret Ashworth in her gray gown with her eyes open, and in the silence that the whole room had built without meaning to, he said the thing he had ridden through a flood to be in time to say, "I will not be crowned without my queen." 7 words. They landed in the marble room and did not echo, because true things do not need to. For one beat, nothing moved. Then the dowager's hand rose toward her collarbone, and did not find her fan, because she had let it fall, and the small clatter of it on the marble was the loudest sound in the room. Lady Cordelia's smile was entirely gone. The clerk on the dais looked down at his finding as though the words on it had rearranged themselves into a language he no longer read. And around the long room, in the tiers of watching faces, the court began, quietly and then less quietly, to recalculate everything it had been certain of an hour before. Julian turned at last to the committee and to the dowager, and he spoke to all of them in the level voice that did not rise. The right was lawful. The bishop has said so, under oath, in this room, before you all. A crown lawfully given is not a charity to be revoked, because the recipient lacks a faction. If the committee wishes to unmake a queen, it may do so, but it will do so knowing that the man it means to crown instead will not wear the thing. I have buried one woman to the proper order. I will not feed it. Another, he had never spoken of Eleanor in public. He did not name her now. The older peers in the room, the ones who remembered, went still in a different way, and the dowager, who had been Eleanor's aunt, who had said "be reasonable" in her own voice once long ago, understood at last what the morning of the flooded road had cost her nephew to reach, and her certainty left her all at once, the way water leaves a cracked vessel. Quietly and completely, the committee did not read the rest of the finding. There was nothing to read it to. A senior peer, the old Earl of Whitmere, who had remembered Eleanor and had never forgiven himself for his own silence, rose from the tiers and said in a voice rough with age that he withdrew his name from the committee. And another rose and did the same. Not with cruelty, not with triumph, but with the slow turning of a room that had been shown something truer than the story it had agreed to believe. No one humiliated the dowager. She was not made to kneel or beg or weep. She simply stood at the center of a room that had stopped listening to her. An old woman who had been right about the order all her life and wrong about the one thing that mattered. and she gathered the fallen fan herself, because no one moved to do it for her, and she left the ball with her spine still straight, which was the only mercy and the only dignity left to her. And Margaret, watching her go, felt no triumph at all, only a strange grief for a woman who had spent 70 years defending a thing that had never once kept her warm. Julian turned back to Margaret. The court was watching, but he had stopped attending to the court. "I should have come to find you 11 years ago," he said low, for her alone. "I was busy, not coming to court. I am sorry it took a flood." And Margaret, who had spent 11 years learning not to want things because wanting was a luxury a borrowed life could not afford, found that her hand had come up of its own accord and rested against the ruined silk over his chest, where she could feel his heart going hard and quick beneath the discipline of his stillness. And she understood that the carved stone man had been as frightened as she was the whole time, and had crossed the room anyway. She did not say a grand thing back. She said, "You pulled a boy from a flood with your coronation coat on." "I did." "My father would have liked you," she said, and that was the nearest thing to love. Either of them spoke aloud that night, and it was enough. And the orchestra, sensing somehow that the evening had changed its meaning, began at last to play. They were married in the small chapel rather than the great cathedral, by the Duke's choosing, and hers with Thomas, carrying the ring on a cushion and gripping the wooden horse, mended now, in his other hand, and the old Earl of Whitmere standing as witness, with tears he did not trouble to hide. The crown that had fallen wrong in spring was set right in winter on both their heads in the same right, and the realm which had wanted a story got a better one than the one it had agreed to believe, and told it for a generation afterward. The one about the Duke who came late to his own crown and found it already where it belonged. The first snow came the night of the wedding. And Margaret stood at the tall window of the apartment that was hers, now, in fact, and not on loan, the window above the garden where she had sat in the wet grass with a crying boy a season before, and she watched the snow come down across the yew where the broken horse had been broken, and the fire was warm at her back, and somewhere below, a boy slept with a mended horse on his pillow. The crown sat on its cushion, across the room, and it no longer looked like a violation. It looked like a thing that had finally found the right head, which had been there all along, standing very still beside an empty throne, minding it for someone, and turning out to be the someone after all. She took the worn miniature from the reticule and set it on the windowsill where the snowlight could reach it. The painted face of a country physician with kind, tired eyes, who had once mended a bird with a hairpin and set a duke's arm on a flooded road, and never known that either small kindness would decades later walk his daughter to a throne. She did not weep. She only touched the brass case once, the way she had touched it 1,000 nights in a borrowed dark. And this time, it was not a thing she held against the loneliness. It was a thing she got to keep. Julian came to stand beside her at the window, and he did not issue any command, and he did not need to, and they watched the snow fall together on the garden that was theirs. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. If Margaret's long road from the borrowed dark to the lit window moved you, leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you, and the next story will be waiting when you are.